A tank on the water. This is not a metaphor. Armor, a cannon, a river, 40 kilometers per hour, and a draft shallower than a puddle after a rainstorm.
Our hero today is the River Tank 1124.
The Soviet Union built nearly 300 of these machines. They fought on 6 fronts of the Second World War. They did what the enemy considered physically impossible. And no one knows about them. Today, I'm going to set that right. Over the next hour, you will learn about an engineer who was only 24 years old, about a factory that overcame wartime shortages using a method that made other engineers shake their heads in disbelief, and about the wooden planks that changed the outcome of an entire campaign. Watch until the end. There is a moment after which river warfare will never look the same again. So, let's begin. There are rivers more important than armies. The Amur is one of them. Look at the map. The Amur stretches for nearly 3,000 kilometers along the border between the Soviet Far East and northern China. Not mountains, not desert. A river. Wide, in some places several kilometers across. In summer, a waterway. In winter, an icy road. In any season, a border that must be held. In the mid-1920s, the Soviet command looked at this border with growing concern. China was collapsing from within. The Japanese Empire was methodically moving from the east. And the Amur military flotilla, the main military force on the river, relied on ships built during the Tsarist era. Some of them were over 20 years old. Imagine, you are guarding a strategic border using a truck manufactured in 1905. The engine sputters. There are no spare parts. And your neighbor is looking at your territory with an increasingly calculating gaze. It was then, in 1925, that Soviet naval officers began seriously discussing river-armored boats. Small, fast, protected vessels that could operate directly on the river, sitting shallow, moving quickly, and carrying real armament. The talk remained just talk until 1929. That year, the conflict on the Chinese Eastern Railway erupted. This railway was jointly controlled by the Soviet Union and China. The Chinese side seized it unilaterally. The Soviet Union responded with force. The Amur flotilla participated in the battles and won. But this victory did not reassure the command. It frightened them. The old ships managed, but they were at their limit. One more conflict like that, slightly more complex, and the limit would be exceeded. And no one intended to postpone the next conflict. By then, Japan had already occupied Manchuria and stood right across the river. A new ship was needed. On November 12, 1931, the command of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Navy approved the technical specifications for 2 types of armored boats, large and small. Both were for the Amur. The requirements were simultaneously simple and almost impossible. The Lodge boat had to carry 2 76mm caliber guns, each in a separate tank turret, plus machine guns, 2 engines. At the same time, the draft, the depth of the hull below the water, could not exceed 70 centimeters. That is less than the knee height of an adult man. This was because the Amur is very shallow in places. And there was one more requirement that explains the entire logic of the project. The boat had to fit onto a standard railway platform. Rivers in the Soviet Union are diverse. The army needed a ship that could be transported to wherever it was needed, fast. The firepower of a tank, the draft of a boat, the mobility of railway cargo. The technical task was sent to the Leningrad Pseudoprojekt design organization on June 22, 1932. And there, it landed on the desk of a man who was only 24 years old at the time. Yuliy Benua was born in 1908. He was the grandson of a famous St. Petersburg architect and his grandfather's namesake. In 1932, he was 24, and on his desk lay a technical task that might have made a more experienced person give up. A ship was needed. But not just any ship. It had to sit no deeper than 70 centimeters in the water, or the Amur wouldn't let it pass. It had to carry 2 76mm guns in armored turrets, or it would be worthless in battle. It had to fit on a train car, or it couldn't be redeployed. And it had to be all of those things at once. Benua started with the hull, a flat bottom, almost vertical sides, no curves that would add height or draft. The hull was divided into 10 watertight compartments. If one was breached, the boat wouldn't sink. The length was just over 25 meters, roughly like 4 cars parked bumper to bumper. For the turrets, Benua took an off-the-shelf solution. The Red Army used the T-28 tank, a medium 3-turreted tank with a 76mm gun. The turret already existed, had been tested, and was in mass production. Why reinvent the wheel? 2 T-28 turrets were placed on the boat's hull. The bow turret had a 300-degree firing arc. The stern turret had 330 degrees. Together, they covered almost the entire surrounding space. For the engines, they also chose a proven path. The GAM-34 aircraft engine, designed by Alexander Mikulin, powerful, compact, and already familiar to Soviet industry. 2 of these engines propelled the boat to 22 knots. That is about 40 kilometers per hour. For an armored river ship with 2 cannons, that was very fast. The crew consisted of 16 people, a commander, 2 motormen, a senior motorman, 8 gunners and machine gunners, 3 helmsmen, and a radio operator. But there was one detail that caused concern. To lower the boat's silhouette, making it a less visible target, the deck under the commander's cabin was lowered by half a meter. It was the right decision. But that depression happened to be where the fuel tank was located. 4 tons of gasoline right under the commander's feet. One lucky shell hit, and the boat would flare up like a match. An engineer named Shatyrinkov proposed a solution that seems almost counterintuitive. The engine exhaust gases were cooled in a special condenser and pumped directly into the fuel tank. As the fuel was used up, it was displaced, but instead of air, it was replaced by exhaust gases, which do not support combustion. There was nothing to ignite the fire. Throughout the entire war, not a single fuel tank on these boats exploded. Not one. By October 1932, the design was ready. Project 1124, the large armored boat. Simultaneously, Benua developed Project 1125, the small one, with 1 turret and 1 engine. In 1933 to 1934, a series was ordered from the Zelenodolsk shipyard number 340, named after Gorky, which was then called Krasny Metallist. Paper was turning into metal, but there is a vast gulf between a drawing and a combat-ready ship, and the first to make this felt was the Amur itself. Zelenodolsk is a small town on the Volga, 30 kilometers west of Kazan. Here, at shipyard number 340, the first Project 1124 boats were laid down in 1933. The factory bet on welding. This is important. In those years, most metal structures were riveted, joining metal sheets with rivets like buttons on a coat. It was slow, expensive, and labor-intensive. Welding allowed metal to be joined faster and more strongly. The Zelenodolsk plant mastered this technology and applied it to the boat hulls from the beginning. This was exactly what made serial production possible in a short time. In early April 1937, the first batch of 28 Project 1124 boats was handed over to the Amur military flotilla. 28 identical armored machines at once. It was a miniature fleet. Let's look at what the flotilla received. The hull was steel, welded, and just over 25 meters long. It was divided into 10 watertight compartments. In the center of the hull was an armored citadel. This was the name for the protected compartment that covered the most vital parts: the engine room, fuel tanks, radio room, and the space under the turrets. The side armor of the citadel extended 200 millimeters below the waterline. A shell hitting the side right at the water's edge would still meet armor. The armoring was serious by riverboat standards. The sides were 7 millimeters. The deck was 4 millimeters. The armor of the T-28 tank turrets was 20 millimeters. Small machine gun turrets were 7 to 8 millimeters. This didn't make the boat invulnerable, but it protected the crew from shrapnel, bullets, and light small arms fire. Maneuverability turned out to be excellent. 2 engines working in different modes allowed the boat to turn almost on the spot. Without a tugboat, without a head start, just using the engines. But it was cramped inside. The height of the living quarters was 155 centimeters. That is lower than most doorways. A person of average height or taller could not stand up straight. 16 crew members lived and worked in this space, sometimes for weeks. Ventilation was natural, through portholes. Lighting was also natural, the same portholes. Water heating was provided, which was a rarity and almost a luxury for a military boat. Spartan conditions. But the boat wasn't built for comfort. Operation quickly revealed the first problem. While moving, the boat was heavily sprayed with water. Splashes from the stem, the front part of the hull, flew onto the deck. It was almost impossible to work there while in motion. The entire crew would be soaked through. The solution turned out to be simple. Engineers from the 2nd Department of the Shipbuilding Administration developed special spray deflectors, metal profiles along the side, resembling a small visor. They threw the water back, preventing it from flying onto the deck. The problem was solved without redesigning the hull. But the next problem was bigger, and it wasn't discovered in a storm or under fire. It was discovered in winter, when the Amur began to freeze. The Amur is not a warm river. Every winter it freezes. First, shuga appears near the shores, a slushy, icy mush made of small crystals. Then, the ice run begins. Chunks of ice of various sizes move with the current. Some are the size of a desk. Some are larger. For a riverboat with a thin steel hull, this is a serious threat. Not because the ice can sink the boat immediately, but because it acts like sandpaper. Ice chunks scraped against the sides and the bottom, stripping off paint and gnawing into the metal. But the worst damage was to the propellers. The blades, thin and precisely calculated, met the ice flows and bent. Sometimes they broke. A damaged propeller means a loss of speed, and a loss of speed on a combat ship means a loss of advantage. The flotilla reported the problem to the command. The command passed the problem to Benua. Benua thought about it and proposed a solution that initially might have made military engineers, accustomed to complex technical tasks, scratch their heads. Wood. Ordinary wooden planks with a thickness of 40 to 50 millimeters were sewn onto the bottom and sides of the boat up to a level of 100 to 150 millimeters above the waterline. Now, the ice met wood instead of steel. Wood is softer. It absorbs the impact and doesn't transmit it further. Skeptics immediately ask the obvious question. What about the draft? A wooden belt adds weight, meaning the boat will sit deeper in the water. And the draft was already calculated down to the centimeter. Benua explained calmly. Wood floats. Its density is less than the density of water. The wooden belt added weight, but simultaneously created additional buoyancy that compensated for that weight. The ice belt had almost no effect on the boat's draft. That left speed. The wooden belt increased the width of the hull and changed its lines, the shape of the surface in contact with the water. The boat became slightly less aerodynamic. The speed dropped. Here, engineer Eduard Eduardovich Pamel stepped in. He developed a special propeller with thickened blade edges. Thicker meant stronger. The ice was no longer as terrifying. And at the same time, it was slightly more efficient for the modified hull. In the end, the boat with the ice belt lost exactly half a knot of speed. A knot is about 1.85 kilometers per hour. Half a knot is less than a kilometer per hour. A loss that is almost impossible to feel in a real battle. On the other hand, the gain was immense. Boats on Lake Ladoga and Lake Onega continued their combat operations for 2 to 4 weeks after navigation for the enemy had already ended. Finnish ships were already docked at the shore. Finnish crews were already looking at the frozen water. But Soviet boats with wooden belts were still heading out to their positions. This is not just a technical detail. 2 to 4 weeks of additional combat capability during a critical period is a real tactical advantage. And there is one more detail that is easy to miss. The flat bottom and almost vertical bow of the boat made it possible to moor directly to the shore, without a pier, without gangways, without a specially equipped landing site. You poke the bow into the bank, and you're done. This was exactly what allowed Project 1124 boats to be used in landing operations. Infantry stepped directly from the deck onto dry land. By 1941, the boats had been refined and tested. In total, by that time, 172 armored boats of 3 projects. 1124, 1125, and the diesel version of the small boat, designated S-40, had been built. But only 71 of them were in service. The rest were waiting for one thing: turrets with guns. And they almost didn't survive that wait. Because June 22, 1941, changed everything in a completely different way. June 22, 1941, changed everything. Not gradually, not smoothly, instantly. Within the first weeks of the war, it became clear that the shipbuilding industry was in a catastrophic position. German troops were advancing rapidly, and factories in the southwest of the country were falling under threat of capture, or were already occupied. The Kiev plant number 300, known as Leninskaya Kuznitsa, was lost. It built boats. Now it was in the occupation zone. In September 1941, something else happened. The Stalingrad shipyard number 264, the so-called Krasnoarmeyskaya Wharf, was transferred to the People's Commissariat of the tank industry. The Soviet Union needed tanks more than ships at that moment. Unfinished boats were urgently moved to Astrakhan, where they were later commissioned. The construction of Project 1124 boats now continued at only two plants: Plant number 340 in Zelenodolsk and Plant number 115 in Astrakhan. However, only the Zelenodolsk plant had experience producing these boats. Astrakhan was starting almost from scratch. But the shortage of factories was only part of the problem. On August 18, 1941, the State Defense Committee decided not only to complete the 68 boats already laid down, but also to lay down 110 new ones. 66 at enterprises of the People's Commissariat of the shipbuilding industry, and 44 at plants of the People's Commissariat of the River Fleet. The decision was right. The logic was clear. One problem: there was almost nothing to build the boats from. T-28 tank turrets had run out. The tank itself had been taken out of production by then. T-34 tank turrets went entirely to the T-34 tanks themselves, which the front demanded in huge numbers. GAM-34 aircraft engines were reserved for the Air Force. Armor steel was taken by tank builders. For the boats, only what others didn't have time to take remained. And then, in the factory yard in Zelenodolsk, a scene unfolded that is hard to imagine without seeing it with your own eyes. Nearly 100 finished boats. Hulls assembled. Motors installed. Crews formed and waiting. Everything ready. Except for one thing: turrets with guns. Without turrets, a boat is not a combat unit. It is just an armored boat. The question of the turrets reached the very top. People's Commissar of the tank industry, Vyacheslav Malyshev, and People's Commissar of the Navy, Nikolai Kuznetsov, conducted negotiations personally. Not about supply volumes, not about quarterly plans, about specific turrets, one by one. Imagine two ministers sitting and negotiating. This turret goes on a tank, this one on a boat, this one back on a tank. This isn't bureaucracy. This is war, where every unit of weaponry counts. In the end, by the end of 1941, there were almost no turrets for the boats. Industry was working at its maximum, but in the other direction. The factories lacked more than just turrets. They lacked raw materials. They lacked equipment. Scarce materials were distributed on a residual basis. First tanks, planes, and artillery, and whatever was left went to the shipbuilders. It seemed production had stopped. But the Zelenodolsk plant did not wait, because there was no one to wait for and no time to lose. And in 1942, the plant did what no one expected of it. In 1942, Zelenodolsk plant number 340 found itself in a position that in military language is called simply no options. No turrets, no standard engines, almost no armor. 18 completed hulls were sitting motionless. One could have written a report to the higher-ups, requested supplies, and waited for an answer. In war, that is called wasting time. Time they didn't have. The factory began solving the problems itself. The first was the armor. Before the war, The factory worked little with armored steel. Boat hulls were made of structural steel, and turrets arrived ready-made from tank production facilities. Now, turrets weren't arriving. And in 1942, the plant mastered working with armor independently. They opened a special workshop. They learned to cut, bend, and weld armored steel right on site. It's not fast and not easy. Armored steel is significantly harder than regular steel and requires different tools and different welding modes. But they managed. The second problem was the engines. The standard GAM-34 aircraft engine went to the needs of the Air Force. It wasn't allocated for boats. But in warehouses and bases across the country, AM-34 aircraft engines of various modifications were accumulating, having exhausted their flight lifespan. For a plane, such an engine is scrapped. For a boat, it's a different story. A boat doesn't climb to altitude. A boat doesn't experience G-forces during maneuvers. The requirements for an engine on a river and in the air are fundamentally different. An engine that can no longer be used on a plane can work perfectly well on the water. The Zelenodolsk plant opened a workshop to convert these engines. Scrapped AM-34 RNB aircraft engines were dismantled and inspected, meaning every part was checked for wear and suitability. Parts that still held up remained. Worn-out parts were replaced. Then the engine was reassembled, but this time with a reversing clutch. A reversing clutch is a mechanism that allows the engine to spin the propeller not only forward, but also backward. On a plane, this isn't necessary. On a boat, it is essential. Without reverse gear, a boat can neither dock at the shore, nor exit a narrow space, nor maneuver properly in battle. This was not improvisation. This was engineering in wartime conditions. By the time both workshops, the armor and the engine shops, were working at full capacity, the 18 Project 1124 boats that had been sitting motionless received everything they needed and were handed over to the fleet. 18 boats. Each had waited for its hour in the factory yard. Now they were heading to war. From then on, the pace only increased. In 1943, the plant delivered 22 Project 1124 boats to the fleet. In 1944, the final 13. But here is a detail that says a lot about how war is structured industrially. By 1944, the Zelenodolsk plant was already 80% dedicated to the needs of the land forces, tanks, artillery, ground equipment. The fleet received only 20% of the capacity. The boats were built, literally, on what was left over. And yet, they were built. Because the people at the plant understood, these boats were needed. Not abstractly needed, specifically, on the Volga, on the Danube, on the Ladoga, on the Azov Sea. There, where they were indispensable. In total, during the war years and after, the factories built 99 Project 1124 boats. According to some data, it was 97. The exact figure varies across different sources. Plus 151 boats of the smaller Project 1125. Plus another 52 boats handed over to the fleet in 1946 and 1947. This was not just a fleet. This was the result of the stubbornness of people who refused to stop. Meanwhile, the boats were fighting on rivers and lakes that most people in the West know nothing about. And it was there that they showed exactly why they were built. When people talk about the Second World War at sea, they usually remember the Atlantic. Convoys, submarines, battleships, aircraft carriers, vast ocean spaces, and the massive ships upon them. But there was another war, a small one, invisible from a great distance. A war on rivers and lakes, where distances are measured in hundreds of meters, not hundreds of miles. Where the shore is always close. Where a ship's draft and turn radius are more important than its tonnage. It was in this war that Project 1124 boats proved irreplaceable. Let's look at the map. Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe. During the years of the Leningrad blockade, it became the only connection between the besieged city and the rest of the country. In winter, trucks went over the ice. In summer, ships. Project 1124 boats worked here, guarding transport routes, countering Finnish vessels, protecting shipments. Lake Onega was nearby. Its own war was happening there too, also against the Finnish side. Lake Peipus in the west, the Baltics, the Danube in the southwest, where the Danube military flotilla operated, the Volga in the very heart of the country, the Azov Sea in the south. This is not one theater of military operations. These are 6 different theaters, and on each of them, there were Project 1124 boats. What were they good for in battle? Firstly, fire support. 2 76mm guns and turrets allowed the boat to target enemy shore positions, crossings, and clusters of equipment on the bank. The gun's firing range was from 5,800 to 6,000 meters. That is nearly 6 kilometers. A boat could hit a target on one bank while standing near the other. Secondly, fighting against river crossings. One of the main tasks for which they were created was to prevent the enemy from moving troops across a river. The boat would appear quickly, hit accurately, and leave before shore artillery had time to find the range. Thirdly, landings. This is where the flat bottom and vertical bow played a special role. A Project 1124 boat could approach any shore, without a pier, without a dock, without a prepared landing spot. It poked its nose into the dirt, and it was ready. Infantry stepped right onto the shore, quickly, without boats and without delay. This sounds simple. In practice, it is the difference between a successful landing operation and a failure. Every minute on open water under fire means casualties. The ability to moor anywhere and immediately reduce those minutes to 0. Now, about the losses. To be honest, not about victories, but about the price. 11 Project 1124 boats were lost in battle. One of them was subsequently salvaged and returned to service. So, 10 units were lost irrecoverably. The main losses occurred in the Sea of Azov. This is understandable. The Azov is shallow, open, and easily targeted. There is nowhere to hide. The enemy's aviation worked effectively there, and a boat on open water was a conspicuous target. Rivers provided cover. Islands, bends, forest-covered banks. The open sea provided nothing. And here, it is important to return to what we discussed earlier. On Lakes Ladoga and Onega, the Finnish side knew how to read the calendar. When navigation ended, the enemy's activity ended. Ice closed the lake, and one could breathe a sigh of relief. Finnish ships docked at the shore. Crews went to winter quarters. The threat from the water was removed for that period. But Soviet boats with wooden ice belts made of ordinary planks continued to go out to their positions for 2 to 4 weeks after the end of Finnish navigation, through water already clogged with slush and small ice, where Finnish vessels could no longer travel. This was unexpected, and it mattered. 2 to 4 weeks is not a trivial amount of time. In that time, a convoy could be conducted. A ground operation could be supported. One could do what the enemy considers impossible, which means they aren't prepared for it. This is exactly the tactical advantage for which Benua invented his wooden planks. Project 1124 boats went through the whole war, from the first weeks to the final days. They were where they weren't expected. They did what they were built for, and a little more. The war ended in 1945. The boats survived. The flotillas continued their service. And then came a time that is more terrifying for military equipment than any battle. Peacetime arrived. Peacetime doesn't kill military equipment with shells. It kills it with accounting. After 1945, the Soviet Union began to restructure. The army was downsized. The navy was rethought. Priorities changed. Nuclear weapons, jet aviation, the ocean fleet. That was where the command was looking. Small river ships fit poorly into this picture. By 1955 to 1958, all river military flotillas of the Soviet Union were disbanded. Not one, not two, all of them. The Amur flotilla, which was the main reason these boats appeared. The Danube flotilla, which went through the war from start to finish. The Dnieper, the Volga, disbanded. Their ships and boats went to the scrap heap, metal to be melted down, engines to the warehouse, or the same fate. Documentation to the archives, where no one looked for it for a long time. In 1965, the few Project 1124 and 1125 boats still on any lists were reclassified. Officially, they became known as artillery boats. A new name, the same fate. 99 Project 1124 boats were built. According to some sources, 97. Plus 203 Project 1125 boats. In total, nearly 300 units. Of those, 3 remain today. 3 Project 1124 boats have been preserved as monuments. Each is at a different point on the map of the former Soviet Union. Each has its own story of how it wasn't sold for scrap. One stands in Moscow, in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, inside a large building surrounded by other equipment and exhibits. You can walk right up to it. You can look at the turret, the same turret that Benua took from a T-28 tank and placed on a river hull. It is still here. The second boat stands in Yeysk, a small town on the shore of the Sea of Azov. The very same Sea of Azov where boats of this type suffered the greatest losses. There is something poignant about it, standing as a monument where things were hardest. The third is in Primorsko-Akhtarsk, also on the shore of the Sea of Azov, also where battles took place. 3 boats out of nearly 300, 1%. The other 290 plus have been melted down. They are gone. No hulls, no turrets, no engines. There are only photographs in archives, entries in combat logs, and the names of the people who served on them. Stand by any of these 3 boats long enough, and you start to think about the crew. 16 people. A living space height of 155 centimeters. 4 tons of gasoline under the commander's feet. A wooden belt against the ice. A tank turret on a river hull. The people who fought on these machines knew all of this. They knew that gasoline was beneath them. They knew that armor holds off bullets, but not everything. They knew that in the Sea of Azov there was nowhere to hide. And they went out anyway. This isn't pathos. It's just a fact. Yuliy Yulievich Benua, who invented these boats at 24, lived a long life. He died in 1966 at the age of 58. He saw his boats fight. He saw them being decommissioned. Perhaps he saw them being cut into metal. It is unknown what he thought about it. But his work remained, at 3 points on the map, in archival photographs, in combat logs, and in the very fact that the River War was won, including on his machines. Let's go back to the beginning. 1932. A young designer, Yuliy Benua, receives a technical task that sounds almost like a mockery. Make a ship with a draft of less than 70 centimeters. Put tank turrets with guns on it. Make sure it fits on a railway platform, and make sure all of it works. He succeeded. Not immediately, not without problems, not without wooden belts made of ordinary planks and converted aircraft engines. But he succeeded. Now let's look at what happened in the end. Project 1124 boats fought in 6 different theaters of war. On Lake Ladoga, during the blockade years when Leningrad held on by a thread. On Lake Onega and Lake Papus. On the Volga, during the most difficult period of the war. On the Danube, from defense to offense. On the Sea of Azov, where they paid the highest price. They supported the infantry with fire. They disrupted enemy crossings. They landed troops where the enemy didn't expect a landing, directly from the deck onto an unprepared shore. They headed to their positions when the enemy thought navigation was closed. And they did all of this on machines that were built under conditions of an acute shortage of everything. Metal, engines, turrets, time. There are things that are easy to measure. 99 Project 1124 boats built. 10 irrecoverably lost in battle. 3 preserved to this day. But there are things that are harder to measure. How many people were transported across rivers under the cover of these boats' guns? How many enemy crossings were destroyed before troops could cross to the other bank? How much cargo passed through Ladoga under their protection? No one can say for sure. But here is what can be said with certainty. The River War was a full-fledged part of the Second World War. Not secondary, not auxiliary. On the territory of the Soviet Union, thousands of kilometers of rivers and hundreds of lakes became real front lines. Whoever controlled the river controlled the crossings, the supplies, and the flanks. In the West, almost nothing is known about this war. Textbooks feature the Atlantic, the Pacific, Normandy. Rivers and lakes remain behind the scenes. But the people who fought on these rivers knew what they were doing and understood why. 16 people in a hole 25 meters long, 155 centimeters of height under the podvolok, as the ceiling is called in the Navy. 4 tons of gasoline under their feet. Armor that stops bullets, but not everything. And 2 cannons looking in different directions, always ready. 3 such boats stand today as monuments. In Moscow, in Yeysk, in Primorsko-Akhtarsk. Metal does not ennoble them. It doesn't make them solemn. They just stand there, exactly as they were. Working machines of war. If you find yourself near any of them, go up to the turret. The same one Benua took from a T-28 tank and placed on a river hole. Look at the metal. At the rivets and the weld seams. At the gun barrel, looking forward, where it always looked. Friends, thank you for watching. Be sure to write in the comments which part of the story struck you the most. See you in the next video.